Sounds like you're here. Hi everybody, my name is Laura John. I am also in the secondary ed cohort, although I have getting my license in history and social studies. And so my topic is increasing student engagement in a social studies classroom, and I want to thank Sonia for two things. One, defining exit tickets so nicely. It's a term I use, and now I don't have to define it, which is awesome. And also sort of talking about how you started with one idea and changed, because that's exactly what happened to me. So this couldn't have gone better, actually. This is really a presentation about the arc of my teacher research project, including some of my conclusions. So I conducted my student teaching internship right here in Waltham, Massachusetts at McDevitt Middle School. If you saw Terry's presentation or Caroline's, we were all at the same school. My classroom was right there, which is pretty awesome. I taught 2 6th grade classes in social studies. The topic in Waltham for 6th grade is ancient history. If you know me, you know that was my dream. At McDevitt, I had the privilege of working with some absolutely amazing students who you can see here. I had 2 classes. Of course, I was insanely earnest about getting them all totally thrilled about history. You see the incredibly dorky smile on my face in all of these pictures. We had just done a thing. You can see me holding it in here. Actually, I'm going to use this cool right here. I am holding a mummified orange. We mummified an orange and then we exhumed the orange. We practiced mummification, so we had just exhumed the orange. It smelled so bad, but it was great, and the kids loved it, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. So I was really thrilled, but I noticed really early on that some of my students just were not doing their work. They were just not doing work. I had 56 students total in my 2 classes, and about half a dozen of them never or rarely turned in homework. They just weren't completing do-nows, they weren't doing exit tickets, they just wouldn't turn them in. Right? I didn't understand what was going on. They were intellectually capable of doing the work. I, like Sonia, had a very diverse class and made sure to differentiate a lot. They were totally capable of doing it. If I chatted with them, no problem. And there didn't seem to be a difference between requiring work at home or requiring work in class. It wasn't like they had a home situation where they couldn't finish the work. Something else sort of had to be going on. So I figured I needed to make a change, which led me to my focus. The focus of my research project was helping students who struggled to complete work get to a place where they more fully engaged with and participated in my class. And for the purposes of my research, participation looked like this. It was completing homework assignments and putting some effort into them, you know, so not just making an X on the page. Completing do-nows and exit tickets in class, participating in class discussion and check-ins. So if I were doing sort of a presentation or a lecture, I would have stops for check-ins and having them do that. And just demonstrating general engagement, you know, looking at me, not putting their head on the desk, occasionally raising their hands. I mean, you'd be surprised in 6th graders. So my research question, like Sonia's, is kind of verbose. We were told to do this. This is not just us. Do non-class related discussions outside of class positively affect student performance in class, including homework completion and participation, and to what extent? In other words, could I increase participation and engagement by cultivating positive relationships with my students based on sort of frequent little check-ins about stuff that wasn't like, hey, did you do your homework today? Did you? Cool. So, the basic idea for this comes from an article that I read in Education Update, and it's called The 2-Minute Relationship Builder. The author talks about a strategy where teachers spend 2 minutes per day, 10 days in a row, getting to know a given student. So it's like a really intensive little one-on-one. The strategy is sometimes called the 2x10 or the 2-minute intervention, and it's usually used as classroom management. So you would do this with a disruptive student, a student who's like always calling out or refuses to sit down, that kind of thing. The theory is that the students really want focused, positive attention with an adult, and they're acting out to get it. And so if you give it to them in some other form, they will become your ally and they will stop the disruptive behavior. I wanted to see if I could use this strategy in sort of a similar format to get students on my side, so that they weren't really disruptive, but they weren't really like participating in class. So it wasn't quite like, oh, they're like a problem student, but they weren't doing well, and I wanted to sort of help them. So I chose to do the 2x10 on 3 target students whose failure to complete work was significantly affecting their grades. Like these were kids who were in danger of failing for the year. So At this point, I want to make you aware of some of my premises that I was operating under. I wasn't so naive to think that if I just sort of chatted with kids a couple of times, they would miraculously change their behavior and start like being my star student. But I did think that maybe my underperforming students weren't doing their work at least in time, at least in part, due to a basic lack of connection to school. Like they just didn't have a connection. So either I felt that like the kids who looked like they just weren't doing work for whatever inexplicable reason weren't doing it not because they made a choice not to do it, like I refuse to do my work, but they were doing it because they weren't investing in school. They just didn't feel comfortable somehow. Maybe they thought they weren't going to succeed. Maybe they had a bad experience in history class. It happens. I mean, I understand. They just weren't feeling a strong enough inducement, and so I wondered if a more personal connection to their teacher, me, would sort of help them with that. And basically, I wanted to challenge assumptions about why students don't do their work, including like the bad student stereotype of like the kid who just doesn't do it, you know. So I thought that if I could help students invest in my class by getting them to feel comfortable taking academic risks, they might participate more, right? They would raise their hands. They would try to do their homework. So, what did I do to try to make some changes? In addition to the 2x10 with my free target students, and I really did, right? 2 days a week, 10 days, all this kind of stuff. I made a point of always standing by the door, right? I would stand right where Danielle is, and I would greet you, and I would be like, well, your classes are those new, that's great. Hey, how about that Sox game last night? You're looking good today. Very good. All the time, right? And I really did it. It was that corny. I really did, right? At the end of the class, I always said thank you. Right? Thanks everybody, have a great day, as they're sort of scrambling and like running out the door. Have a great weekend, enjoy the nice weather. You know, if somebody told me they were doing something, I would sort of shout it out. Like this. These felt pretty authentic to me. I don't know how many of you have spent time with 6th graders, but it's intense. And that intensity kind of rubs off on you, so you get like, you get all kinds of excited about them. Something else that felt really authentic to me is this last one, just because of who I am. It's a little bit more intellectual, and it involved exit tickets and do-nows that were reflective of student activity. So asking them to think about what we had done. And I did that as part of my research, mainly to make sure that it wasn't specific tasks that they hated, like it was something that they thought was really cool that everybody thought stunk. I wanted to make sure that that wasn't what was going on. At the end of my research project, I analyzed my data. I had a lot of qualitative data, but I also had some quantitative data, because I was looking at participation. So this graph shows the participation rates of my students. You can see students A, B, and C at the bottom. Those are my 3 target students. You can see the average of both of my classes, including those 3 target students. This is all 56 of my kids. The colors are sort of like on a time scale. So before I was student teaching, the part of term 2 and term 3 where I took over, and early term 4. So these 3 are when I was teaching, and I was trying to implement all of these things. I'm sure you're noticing something about this graph right now, which I noticed. When I was even doing this research, like before I had gotten to this stage, I kind of knew that this wasn't working. I sort of had this sense that the 2x10 was not positively impacting the 3 kids that I wanted to positively impact. I could just tell. I wasn't really keeping track of it, but I could kind of tell. And I think this graph really shows that participation rates did not increase in a measurable way. I can talk if you want during questions about why term 4 is like so horrifying, but I don't think it was me, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. Danielle has not left the room, so I shouldn't have said that. But I did get some data that I thought showed that I could actually positively impact participation, and this brings me to exit tickets, which I'll explain in a second. This is an example of a specific kind of exit ticket, and I have 4 versions of this. So the exit ticket, this is pretty standard for me. I like the little exit ticket logo, and I used to make these up just like Sonia. They would be kind of double duty, right? So at the top, we had learned about Greek colonies. So at the top, I'm just checking for understanding. In your own words, describe what a colony is and why did the Greeks need colonies. They should have learned that, so I'm hoping that they would be able to do that with me. And then this last part is the part that I'm interested in right here. What happened was the day before this, I had given my students an iBook. They all had iPads, so I was making all these iBooks, and they had studied the iBook, and then they had a graphic organizer to sort of take notes. This was their homework, right? So they had to read on their own and do this. During class this day, we watched a couple of video clips, they listened to the video clips, and they filled out a different graphic organizer. Same topic, just slightly different information. And I asked them, and I know it's hard to read, I asked them, compare today's class to yesterday's. Did you prefer learning by reading or by watching and listening to videos? Explain your answer. They had to circle one, reading or watching and listening, and then explain. The class split 50-50. They really did. Students tended to say that listening was more fun, or they just sort of preferred being read to. Or the reading ones said they liked reading at their own pace with all the information available. They liked to be able to find it for themselves. They didn't have to want to wait for it to come. So I'm showing you these exit tickets because this is pretty much the moment where I realized that in order to increase participation, I had to increase engagement. I had to give them what they wanted, which is a very dangerous concept, but I had to get them interested in what was going on in class. Which brings me to my conclusions. So first of all, I figured, shocking, I know, planned targeted interventions with students aren't terribly feasible. Planning to do something like that doesn't work. For my purposes, when I started, I thought, oh, outside of class, I have a homeroom. I'll meet with kids in homeroom, right? No. 6th graders in homeroom, then it is like a minefield of interpersonal social relations. And for me to just be like, hey, how's it going, guys? It was like bombs going on. They didn't want to know me. I went to the cafeteria one time and was like, hey, what looks good today? And it was literally like a record scratch. Like, all eyes. And everyone was like, you know, I was like, oh, it's cool, I don't care. You know, it was like being in 6th grade again. So it doesn't really work, right? This is tough. I feel like if you were part of a club, or you did a sport, it would be a lot easier. But my student teaching, it just didn't work. Instead, listening to student feedback to try to figure out sort of what was engaging, figuring out why and when students get invested actually works far better. I was able to implement some things that they wanted to do. And had I realized it earlier, I could have implemented even more. Ultimately, I believe that without both efforts to maximize feelings of safety and support, like the kind of thing you're trying to do with the 2x10, and efforts to maximize interest, you cannot have engagement. You might have participation, but you won't have engagement. So that's what I'm going to work on as I move forward in September. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Yeah.
So what happened in term 4?
So there's 2 things that happened in term 4. Term 4 is spring, and spring fever is real, like no joke. The other thing that happened in term 4, so a couple of my target students, one of them actually went on a 3-week-long trip out of the country and didn't tell anybody before she left. So it was just like suddenly this kid was gone. So she didn't do any work. I could have flubbed her numbers. The other student had a serious disciplinary problem in like a different area, not with me, but it really impacted her behavior at school. Like it was just really, she just, which is a small sample size is going to give you weird data like that. But term 4, I mean, everybody just was like, it got nice. It was hard to pay attention. It happens.
I wanted to ask a question about your concept of engagement.
Yeah.
So you had said eye contact versus putting their head down on the table. What were the other ways you operationalize engagement?
I mean, it's a great question because I really didn't. So I started out with participation, and that's a word you saw a lot throughout it because I could measure participation, right? Was the homework done? Did I get an exit ticket? I could watch a video of my teaching and see how many students raised their hand. But I realized that kind of like Sonia, like sometimes they do what you want them to do, but they're not doing it for the reason you want. Like they're doing it because they know they're supposed to, but they don't really care, So measuring engagement was something I hadn't really planned on trying to do, and by the time I realized that's what I wanted, I knew I couldn't measure it. Like it was too late. We had such a tiny little amount of time to do this. For me, like having students make eye contact is big, although that's not everything. But I think that engagement for me is like something you can just feel in a classroom. If anybody is a teacher, you can like just smell it. Like you can just tell when everybody's checked out, And it doesn't even mean like putting your head down. It's just like a kid will just kind of be, like that. Or the second you stop talking directly to them, they're like, like under on their phone. So you can just kind of, you can just kind of tell. But I think that for me, if kids are participating in a measurable way, they have to be engaged. Like if they're doing all of those things, turning in all of their homeworks, doing all the do-nows, that you can't do any of that. You can't do all of that unless you're engaged. So it's a good question. I don't know that I would try to like ever measure engagement. I I just don't know how we would do that. But it's something that I sort of recognize, like, there's a difference between, the calculatable participation rate that I have and like engagement, which is a broader category. Yeah.
Did you find that the people that like reading more versus the people like watching more, was there a difference in terms of what they got done, in terms of their homework or what they completed?
No, that's interesting because I did several versions of that kind of exercise where I was like, let's try two similar but different things and ask them what they think. And then I looked at who was handing stuff in, and they were handing stuff in regardless of who they were. They were on the same trend, most of them. Most students, if they tended to do their work, they continued to tend to do their work no matter what it was. Like Sonia, I had students on 504s and IEPs. They had sort of like specialized needs. And so for those students, for example, for the iBook, I mean, it's not I'm sort of like shooting my research in the foot here. But for the iBook, like I did a voiceover track. So they were also listening to the iBook because they had, like they couldn't read enough by themselves and sort of do that. So they were also listening. So it was sort of a false dichotomy to be like, watch this video versus read the iBook. Like they're listening to both of those. A lot of my students were, But still, many of those students who I would read the iBook for said, oh, I prefer watching the video. Like they just wanted visual stimulation instead. That didn't seem to be like sort of a clear divide between those two. Yeah. Anything else? We good? Yeah.
How did you spend special time with your students? Like, what did you actually do? And was it in the classroom, and do other kids care?
Yeah. To start at the end, nobody else cared. They're like supremely disinterested in what you do. So in their own space. Most of what I tried to do was either literally in the classroom because I had homeroom. All three of my target students were in homeroom. So I would try to catch them as they were coming in instead of letting them sit in their cliques and like, sometimes I would go to the cafeteria. Sometimes I would like be in the hall in between classes and I would see them. I hung out after school. There was a couple of after school programs that were either in the classroom or like next door. And so I would just sort of like be there, and be like, hey, how's it going today? Like, so that's where I did it. What I tried to do with them was just to say things like, how's it going? Or yeah, or when I found out that somebody had a younger brother who was coming to McDevitt eventually, I'd be like, you think he's ready? What do you think he's gonna like the most? I would just kind of chat about that.
Right.
So I was trying not to make it about school, but sometimes it ended up being about school, but it was never about like, are you ready for your test?
Right.
Did you? I don't want to stress them out about that. Yeah. But a lot of kids wore sports jerseys. A lot of kids were obviously into sports, like watching movies. I would say things like, oh, I went to see the new Whatnot movie, and they'd be like, oh, me too. They were really into that. So there was a lot of that. Danielle, last question, I think. I'm going over time. I know there's only 2 of us, but.
So I'm curious about, I had never heard of the 2x10, and so that fascinating. David, who's back here, one of your colleagues, and I recently had a conversation about, we talked about the importance of building relationships with kids, and I'm wondering if you felt or noticed a difference between building a sort of personal relationship around their extracurriculars and building a personal intellectual relationship around, not did you study for the test, how did you do on that test, but like kids who are excited about the orange or mummies, or if there was a different level of personal relationship with kids who you could talk about the content and kids who you could talk about the Red Sox.
Yes, there was. The short answer is yes, and I noticed it right away. Because I'm a history nerd, and if any kid wanted to talk to me about history, I was instantly like, yeah, you and me, we're best friends. Because it's just my thing, I was really excited about that. And I'm not that I don't love the Sox, but I was less excited about that. And also the content-based ones, I think this is the real key, tended to be student-initiated. They wanted to talk to me about the orange. I didn't have to go like, hey, so what did you think about the orange, right? They were like, Miss John, is the orange done? Because it was on my desk for months, curing. And they would be like, is it done? Is it done? They would want to talk to me and then I would engage them, as opposed to me talking to them about stuff. So there's a big difference. I'm not sure how I could, to borrow your word, operationalize that. I'm not sure how I could make that work for me, but yeah, I definitely had what I felt like were more authentic relationships with the students who were just interested in history, which is potentially a personal failing, but I was just like,
or the opposite.
I don't know.
I mean, I would say maybe David and I were trying to figure this out. It may be the opposite, that like pretending that we're going to build personal relationships with kids may not actually
Yeah.
change what happens in the classroom.
Yeah.
But intellectually, being a friend of their minds
Yeah.
can change,
I believe in the 2x10 as a classroom management strategy. I don't know that I believe in it as an engagement and participation strategy after this. I think for me, my test was proved that you cannot use this. Like, it might work for kids who are acting out, it's not really great for kids who just don't care about the beach run. Imagine it, people, because it's there. So thank you so much for your time. I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you to everyone for coming today. We are done in this room really early because we only had 2 presenters. Lucky you. At this point, it's very, very early, but everyone is invited to go back to the main room where you started the day. Sherman, this is where we will end the day. We're going to actually have the sort of graduation ceremony, after which there will be a nice reception. So if you want to sort of mosey on your way back to Sherman, that is where we are going to end. Thank you so much for your time.